I'm Joan Quinn, and welcome to the Beverly Hills View. Our guest is Russian-born artist Zhenya Gershman, who started building an international reputation at the age of 14 with an exhibit in St. Petersburg. She came to America soon after that with her parents, enrolled in the Otis Art Institute, where she was one of the youngest students ever to be admitted. Zhenya graduated with honors and went on to earn her MFA from Art Center College of Design. She's exhibited in galleries all over the world, continues painting hours on end in her West Los Angeles studio, but she did have a life in Beverly Hills, so we're going to hear all about that today. So how did art come into your life, Zhenya?
Art pierced me like a cupid with an arrow when I was 10 years old. And art for me is always a response. It's an emotional response to humanity. And I watched a film called Mephisto with Brandauer.
Yes.
And it was so emotionally charged and so overflowing that I felt full to the brim and had to do something about it.
But you said at 10, so that
Yes.
was going on in Russia. Where were you living?
I was in Moscow in Russia, and it was very daring for television to actually put this film on. And they showed it in two parts. They broke it up in part 1 and 2. And in between the two parts, I ran to my room, and I just almost blindly picked up paper and drew this flying demon in the middle of nowhere.
Do I have it?
Yes.
I have it.
Yes, my very first.
This is your first drawing, and it's so amazing that you still have it.
I carried it with me because as soon as I did this, my mom looked at it and she said, my mom Irina, she said, "You're an artist." And I carried this drawing because that's the moment my artist was born.
And then it continued, which was also kind of daring in Russia. How could you have an exhibit at 14?
Well, in fact, my mother immediately took me to an art school, and I was 10 years old. And at the art school, they said, "She'll never be an artist, she's too old."
At 10?
Because
that was the era when ballerinas and gymnasts all started very
5
young.
years old, by 10 you are professional.
Yeah.
And they said, "Are you kidding me? She doesn't know how to draw Greek busts. She doesn't know perspective. At 10, this is too old. She's too late." So what my mother did then, she introduced me to two phenomenal artists who were in their late 70s, if not early 80s. And they were friends of my grandfather, who was a poet. And they were my mentors. And for years, they mentored me privately.
So they weren't afraid to have you be an artist at that age.
And I just painted every day ever since.
But the thing is, your parents left.
Yes.
And why did they leave Russia?
Yes, so you have to imagine we had the Gorbachev and Glasnost right when I was a teenager.
Oh, you did?
And during that time, for the first time since the Soviet regime, there was an opening to talk about the horrors that were done politically to artists, a lot of artists and cultural leaders.
Oh, right.
And as a teenager, it was shocking. This is my coming into an intelligent young woman. And I begged my mother every day to get out of the country. I wanted to live in a place where there was a freedom of speech and where you were free to move anywhere you wanted.
But they were very prominent in Russia, even though you couldn't exhibit because you weren't old enough. But they knew these older people who took you on, who mentored you, and they had a prominent career.
And funny enough, both of my parents are doctors, but funny enough, I actually had the show, as you mentioned, when I was 15 and 14. So it wasn't going to school was a problem, but I had a really interesting exhibition in St. Petersburg with all the portraiture that I've done under this mentorship. So if I had stayed in Russia, in some ways, perhaps I would have had an easier career, but as an individual, I would have had a harder time. My mother became an incredibly successful acupuncturist. Her office is around the corner.
She's in Beverly Hills, I know.
She's known as Chi Mom.
Chi Mom?
Because
she moves the chi in your body?
All the babies in the strollers you see in Beverly Hills, she made them.
Oh, because they got pregnant when she was moving the chi around?
Yes,
That's great.
Yeah.
And your father is at UCLA?
My father is really the reason we came, because he was so known as a gastroenterologist. He had many papers, books out, and he was invited by UCLA. And there was a remarkable opportunity because they said, unlike every other doctor that came to America, you could practice from the moment you set foot in America. And so he had the license to go in and practice right away.
So they knew that they had a place to come,
Yes.
both of them, because
we had
of
the place, but no money.
Well, but they were able to come. Did they get help once they came here, or did they just go right to work?
No, it was a journey.
And they live in Beverly Hills. Both
Yes.
your father lives here.
And I should say that one of the reasons, if we back up why we came, and I was mentioning it early a little bit to the producers here on the show, that we watched in Russia, in Moscow, Pretty Woman. And don't laugh.
Oh,
But-
Beverly Wilshire Hotel.
And there is a scene at the very end of the movie, and it wasn't just that I fell in love with Richard Gere, who was so handsome, of course.
Who didn't?
And I wanted all those outfits, of course, of Pretty Woman. But it was the homeless at the end who walks down the street and he says, if you want to if you have dreams, come to Beverly Hills, come here. This is the place for dreamers. And we looked at each other and said, we're out of this country. We're going to Beverly Hills.
Isn't that great that could influence you?
Yeah.
Gary Marshall, who also was a fantastic person, and the cast of that movie. And you never know how far something like that is going to influence a person. Who will see it? And here it is. You're saying that was a big influence.
We didn't know exactly where we're going to end up. At first, we lived in West Hollywood. But to all my friends in Moscow, I said, so long, I'm going to Beverly Hills.
We love West Hollywood. That's our neighbor.
Exactly.
So your parents came here. They live here now, and they live next to Tony Duquette's house.
Yes.
Did you know Tony Duquette?
It was amazing. One day I was walking with my 2-year-old daughter in her stroller, and I was pushing her up Donridge, which is kind of a heavy street, right?
Yeah.
And the door was open, and my mouth dropped.
I know.
It was like Alice in the Wonderland.
Well, it's like a museum, right?
Well,
And it is now.
It's the world's best bathroom. Don't laugh. Like when you go into the Tony Duquette's bathroom, it's covered with Russian icons, head to floor. So I probably spend the longest in this bathroom than any bathroom in the world.
looking at all the icons.
I really couldn't believe gold icons. It's incredible.
So now you live in West LA,
Yes.
and you have a
Brentwood.
studio there,
Correct.
and you do a lot of painting there, I guess.
I do enormously large scale paintings, and I probably have the smallest studio right now that I've ever had, and I've done the largest work that I've ever made.
One thing that you did bring was this story from the Courier to prove that you've been here for so long.
Excellent.
1999. Tell us what it is.
Well, I can't even remember who exactly, which manager or art connection that got me into this, but there was a charity event, and I love helping with my art. That's something that I've even started a nonprofit. I can tell you a little later about.
We'll talk about your nonprofit that you started.
I love the fact that you can make a difference with what you love doing. And so I donated my art to this event in Beverly Hills where they showed beautiful paintings in the car dealership. And we had all this space where Mercedes,
Mercedes right on Beverly Boulevard.
And it was just kind of incredible because sort of like cars, but it was museum-like at the same time.
It's a beautiful space.
It
It's
was
very tall ceilings.
Yes, so that was my first foot in the door in Beverly Hills.
And then you also met and someone mentored
Yes.
you, Richard Weisman, who lives in Beverly Hills. His mother lived here. I was on the California Arts Council with Marcia Weisman,
Yes.
her brother Norton Simon, the Simon Museum in Pasadena, and you were connected to them.
I've been blessed with meeting incredible people throughout my life. We might not have had a lot of money when we got here, but the treasure trove of people that we met is just, you can't put a price tag on that. And so when I graduated from Otis, I was about 20 or 21, and I met Douglas Simon, who's the grandson of Norton Simon.
Oh, Douglas Simon, right.
Douglas Simon.
Richard's.
He went on a journey looking for an artist to represent, to kind of like connect to his grandfather, to do something with the arts. And he found me because he came to Otis and looked at all these artists. Hundreds of students graduated. He picked my art. I didn't know who he was. He wanted to hide it from me. He wanted to see if I would connect, on just a human level. And, it was just an incredible journey. It was like an artist Cinderella. It was like a Pretty Woman in the arts. The next thing he said, what would you say? I mean, he was a stranger to me, but what would you say if somebody said, I will sponsor and organize an art solo exhibition in one of the most prominent galleries in LA? And I said, you know, you teasing, like, that's not nice to tease an artist. He said, no, I'm actually, I said, I'm actually offering this to you, you know, and later he told me who he was. But one of my first solo shows was at Richard Heller in Bergamot Station.
Oh, so he arranged,
and he brought all these people. I mean, it was, you know, his father, of course, Donald.
It was
Richard Weisman.
The son of Donald, right?
Every painting was sold, and I mean, it was just amazing to me because I'm 21, you know, and this is just happening like magic. And then we delivered the painting. So in Donald's house in Beverly Hills, we had to push a Picasso and a Chagall a little bit, like, to make, because my paintings are large even then. So you're gonna like squeeze me in between.
They have. Judy and Don had a beautiful collection of art, and of course Richard Weisman was a friend of mine through Andy Warhol and through his mother.
Yes.
Marcia.
Yes.
And so that whole family is very, very tied to the art world.
Richard was so supportive. He has about 10 of my pieces in his collection.
But you know what? He loved those big paintings too.
Yes.
Are they big paintings?
Yes, and he had those big portraits of OJ actually, and Warhol's. Remember?
He sponsored the sports series with Warhol.
Yes.
And so he had that whole series of huge sports figures.
Exactly.
So let's go back to, we're talking about this, and you said you graduated from Otis. You went to two totally different kinds of art schools.
Yes.
Otis, tell us about that, because they're like night and day to me.
Yes. So Otis was, I think it was one of the best schools at the time when it was in MacArthur Park.
Right.
And it was so loose, and you could, you know, pick up the bullets from the gangs on the street and, you know, as a kid, and just incorporate it into your artwork. I'm not saying that gangs are great, but it was just so creative, and you had the fashion industry, and you had all these things happening.
Because they had so many different schools there. In fact, they were just starting the fashion school there when I was curating work for the art gallery. Mm-hmm. And I had shows of Issey Miyake and Sandra Rhodes and Rene Boucher, the illustrator, and Thierry Mugler. And it was a great gallery. It was, as you say, right on the street overlooking MacArthur Park. But we built the fashion department that way.
And that was a privilege to have all of this kind of fluidity. And then what we had was remarkable. We had the best ceramic department with the biggest kilns you could find. We had a printmaking studio where you could do etching with, and this is before you had to be careful in lawsuits, so you could dip your hands into acid and do the real printmaking. So
you did all of this?
I did lithography, the stone lithography, everything. And then we had, so we had ceramics, and we had the welding, the bronze welding forge. We cast our own bronze.
They were really ahead, weren't they? Ken Twitchell was teaching there. Who else was teaching?
I mean,
there?
We had Rick Oggins.
Oh, Rick Oggins, who was great.
I mean, he gave us the welding torch, and we would cut metal. You know, I mean, you imagine you're like 17, you're a girl, and you're wearing a welding suit, and you smell the metal, and it's just so exciting. I knew I wanted to be a painter, but to be able to explore all these materials.
But to do ceramics. And to do welding, and they gave you this full education.
And the printmaking was, you know, my love, I think, for alchemy was really born there. I mean, you had all this invisible made visible, you know, it was remarkable.
Interesting. One other thing we did in the gallery that I thought was very far ahead is Richard Mock had a show there. Richard Mock sat at a table like we're sitting, and people would come in without an appointment and sit, and he would paint them. And all the canvases were the same size, and he built this whole exhibition. As he painted, it would go on the wall. And remember that?
Amazing. And you know, it just reminded me that other people who were incredible, the two Toms, the Tom Nechtel and Tom Woodle. And I just have to say, Tom Woodle was such a breath of fresh air, because conceptual art was at the height, and if you wanted to make things, you were not cool. And he was cool with making things. And we walked into his class. He had just fallen in love with Van der Weyden. And he was teaching us for the first semester. We had to take red, yellow, and blue and mix by hand a perfect black. It was it was like an apprenticeship,
He is such a teacher. He's still teaching. He does individual teaching. He teaches downtown.
Yeah. He looked at us and he said, art is not fun. Art is not entertainment. Many of you will never become artists. Those who will become artists will not go on to make art. Those who will survive will be true artists.
And it's really interesting that an art teacher will say that, because everyone there wants to be an artist,
so
right?
creative, but it was the seriousness and the respect for the profession that I really appreciated.
So we've covered what went on at Otis, and that school is now moved to Inglewood, past there near the airport. But Art Center in Pasadena, to me, was always slick and commercial, and you got your master's there.
I'm amazed that I got accepted, because they only take 5 painters a year, so that was a real gift.
For the master's program?
For the master's program. And the other 4 painters weren't even painting. I was the only one that was actually painting.
What were they doing? Different forms of work?
Growing bacteria on the canvas or something like that.
Very far out, like Andy Warhol. The pea paintings, where you used to pee on the canvas to see what the action would take place on the canvas.
So there was a pleasure to get in, and got tons of scholarships. It was a privilege to go there, and then it was very different, because
it wasn't commercial, because I thought it was very commercial.
No, because what they put your graduate department for artists in Del Mar Studios in the Old Town, in this old abandoned building where in the 20s they sold old cars, and each student got a studio. And you made a portfolio, and you had a team of phenomenal artists who would come through. You would sign up, and you'd say, okay, I want Skip Arnold, the greatest performer, come and look at you signed up. And you know what I did? There was this great, Chris Kraus. The list goes on and on and on and on. And I would sign up instead of half an hour for 2 hours and ask them to pose for a portrait.
Oh,
and
so
I made
you keep them an extra hour.
So I said, you guys don't have to do anything. You get paid, and I get a model.
That's great.
So it was really fun.
So the one interesting thing that you said is that Pasadena does use their old buildings for artists and different things. I think that's a great thing, Beverly Hills, because we have some warehouses here too.
Yes.
And then they also use storefronts that weren't rented and gave them to artists. That's something that we have to remember here. Because I think that's a great thing to do. So what other teachers of yours influenced you? We talked about Rick and Tom Woodle, Rick Ogans and Tom Woodle.
I have to say a shout out to Robin Vaccarino.
Really?
Do you know Robin?
I've heard it. I don't know.
She's a remarkable woman, and she came in because there was a lot of, we had the top 5 advisors who we called sort of the Art Mafia, which was Mike Kelly, and you had a little Albuquerque. There were museum artists who almost couldn't believe they were real. You just wanted to pinch yourself that they're in your studio. But maybe it wasn't their fault, but it was more we were intimidated that there was this barrier, right? But Robin walked into to my studio and said, "Gershman, you're going to be famous," and she was just so funny and so lovely, and she was
teaching that. Was she teaching just in the master's program, or was she on the faculty?
She was one of the list of the adjunct faculty that you could sign up for, and she became part of my thesis committee along with Lita
Albuquerque
and Jeremy Gilbert-Rolfe, and Mike Kelly was on my committee, and Robin.
So they all look at your work,
yes,
and they critique
Mike
it.
Kelly was. It's an embarrassing story, but it's the best story, because he came in, he looked at my art silently, and he said, I don't really understand this type of painting, so I'm not going to pretend. So let's talk about something else.
Oh, because he did installations.
He didn't do portraits.
No, he did installations.
But he didn't go on and critique me and say this is not good. He just said, it's not my kind of thing.
That's great.
So I actually appreciate it.
But he also respected your kind of thing. I just went to a Mike Kelly show at Hauser Wirth in New York, and it was memory, and it was from the period you're talking about, because he was collecting things from different thrift shops and from different art fairs, and he made them into big sculptures, but small pieces.
If I can share, just the memory is so important to me, because
it was memory.
There's a generation of artists in my family. My great-grandfather was one of Russia's first photographers. Actually, he was in then Ukraine. And he did photographs of all the people in his town. Anybody who had a birthday or and a funeral, birthday, bar mitzvah, whatever it was, they had to come through his studio. Then my grandfather, who was a writer, wrote a book that's called Family Album, when he's looking through these photographs and he opens a dimension of memory.
Yes.
And then I used those photographs to make a series of paintings. So that it traveled, these images traveled through time, through different media.
From generations. That's what Mike was talking about too, saving those generations from before, be they something that, like a button or an earring or something that they found, or whatever he found. And you're talking about passing that on, and I know Art Table just had a show, not a show, but they came over to visit your studio. They had an event, and it was like a salon because you talked about art. Tell us a little bit about that, and then we're going to take a break.
Okay. Well, I wear many hats. I wear hat of an artist, art historian, and educator. And a lot of times it's separate, but for this event, I wanted to bring it together. So rather than being, you know, even a little bit like an interview telling about myself right now, I wanted it to be an art experience. So what we did, it's almost like a meditation with art, and we unpacked 4 words. We thought about the roots and etymology of the word art itself.
So you started with that.
We started with just thinking, you know, I've asked everybody, well, we are all art, you know, it's a powerful room of women in the arts.
Art Table,
I said, where do you think the word art comes from? And there was a silence, and it was almost like a little embarrassment. And I said, don't worry, I didn't know until a few days ago, until it occurred to me that we might call ourselves an artist, but we don't actually wonder what the roots are. And art comes from the word, a Latin word, ars, A-R-S, and shortened A-R, old version of English, which means being in the moment, being in the now.
Ars, yes.
Ars, we're being, and that moment can travel through time. So we kind of had this an amazing creative experience, and then I unveiled certain paintings to accompany those words.
And those paintings were bigger than life.
Yes.
You had them, I know, there were curtains over them,
The
and then you
entire-
pulled the curtains, and then what was there? 2 big hands?
And it's one of my latest painting. It's oh gosh, maybe probably 13 feet across, and it's 2 giant hands just levitating. They're hands that you could see of a working man, of a gardener, with all the crust and all the wrinkles, and they're just coming towards you, and it's not really clear if they're trying to connect with you, lift you. I mean, you are this big when you stand next to this painting, so they could easily scoop you up, or they could put you down or protect you. And that was the painting that we unveiled together.
That was fabulous, because that also goes back into your memory. What are you doing? How are you going to do it? Just what we were talking about. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back in a few minutes and talk more to Zhenya Gershman.
If I got to go to college, oh my goodness. I like discovering new things. You get to see what works for you and what doesn't. That helps you evolve as a person. You get to make like a supernova of skill or talent or whatever it is. I've always wanted to go to college. I just feel like that's my destiny. My name is Queen, and I am your dividend.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course. Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
Welcome back to the Beverly Hills View. I'm Joan Quinn, and I'm talking to artist Zhenya Gershman. So, we've been talking about everything.
Yes, it's exciting.
But we didn't actually pinpoint the style of art that you work in. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you have a name for it or what you would call it.
Okay. Well, just to make it simple, I'd like to call it, you know, you've heard of surrealism, which is
right?
I call it subrealism, which is subjective realism.
Which means?
Which means that there are so many realities. I don't believe in photoreality or an abstraction, but I would look at you and bring out the reality that I see through my art. That's just as real as you sitting here, but it's a parallel world. So it's a subjective realism.
But it's not exactly realism where it's like to the point because you use a different kind of a stroke and a different kind of feeling
And within
toward
the
it.
painting, it's very interesting how you establish realism. I love painting parts that come forward and are supremely painted to the detail that you actually can feel like you can grab onto almost in 3D. And other places are just untouched and left for imagination. So within your own work, you can create layers of what's real and not real. There is, you judge against the painting itself.
I didn't realize that because some of the paintings are very, very smooth and flat, right? And some are very heavy. I wasn't thinking about that. I was only thinking about those big brush strokes.
Yeah, and lately, what I might not look like it, but I'm a bit of a rebel when it comes to art. And what I love doing is doing the wrong thing. You know, if I was in a class and somebody said, "Don't put anything in the middle," I'd immediately paint something with it in the middle. And so what I love doing, the technique that I've been developing lately, is more of an engraving and carving and sculpting in paint. So I don't even use brushes for the most time.
So
I
what
use,
do you use?
Ceramic tools. So the kind of ceramic tools you would use for if you throw on the wheel,
A pot.
and then you kind of create textures, and they're
Yes.
knives and corrugated objects.
Some of them are wood, or
Yes,
some of them wood,
plastic,
and some of
wood, metal, and I layer the paint, I carve into the paint, I move it, I scratch it. It really feels like a surgery of some sort.
back to the doctor.
Exactly. I mean, that's the failed doctor here. And then when it's on such a large scale, and if I'm doing an eye that's this big, I'm actually kind of dancing with it. And you have to do a lot of backing, you know, it's a lot of abstraction that's built into
Are your
it.
brushes big?
Yes.
When you use
You
them?
only
How-
use
how
house
big?
brushes.
I should have had you bring a brush.
Yeah, I would have loved to. I brought my palette.
I know. But the brush?
But the brushes are house brushes. I love cheap materials that I don't have to worry about, and that just, you know, I could just throw away. And I love you know, there's no such thing as bad brush, right?
Well, especially if you're talking about carving into things.
Yes, and also how they dry, they can create all kinds of textures.
So you don't have to clean them. You don't care if they're cleaned in turpentine. You use oil, though, right?
I have a passion for oil, and though this palette right here is as dry for now almost 20 years, I'd actually, when I carried it to the show, I discovered the paint was all over my books.
Oh, because it's falling off?
Because oil is like a human being. We have a skin that you can touch, but inside pulsates our blood. Same thing, if you push on the dry oil, the skin can ooze and relieve what the oil underneath is never dry, like Van Gogh's paintings.
How long does it take to dry?
It only forms the skin over itself, and underneath, like Van Gogh's paintings, are never dry underneath.
They were thick.
When it's thick like this,
Yeah.
has a skin, but
That's
wet
what I mean.
and
They're still thick,
still alive.
This is very historic,
Yes.
this palette. And we talk about memory, and we've talked about a lot about history and your background. Tell us about the palette since you brought it up, and it's so beautiful. It's a painting in itself.
Thank you. I have an affinity for palettes, and I collect them, but perhaps because this palette was my teacher. And this palette actually is not mine. It belonged to my aunt, who passed away, unfortunately, when I was 4 years old.
And you have her palette?
And I have her palette. She was an incredible artist. There's her book. She became an incredible art historian, and she was a remarkable poet. But when she was younger, she painted, and she actually went to an art school, took art classes, and she painted with oil. She was quite amazing. And when I was 10, after I made my first drawing, I had this affinity. I wanted to make thick, crusty, amazing paintings in oil. And I found in an attic an easel, her old easel. Inside was this palette.
This was all in Russia.
This was all in Russia. And so talk about those objects that speak to you. So this palette, I looked at it, you know, it's so foreign, but you just, it began speaking to me. It said, you put your lights here, you put your darks here, you put your warms here, you put your cools here.
Your paintings you're talking about, the tubes, you're
just even
them out.
And I just followed her voice, even though it was invisible, unheard, but there it was.
And these?
And these, I just figured you'd have to put something in there, and it was two very stinky materials, which I later learned it was turpentine and oil.
I was going to say, you didn't know that at the time, right?
But I had no idea, and I just stick the brushes.
Were they fixed on here? They're fixed on the palette.
Yeah, it was just glued. It was, but again, the tubes never dry so that everything was, even though she was gone for so many years, the paint was wet in the tubes.
And then you added something.
And then later, when I felt that this palette was done talking, I wanted to add the artist eye, and you could see a little painting that that I added from the back, the way that they make old dolls, where they put the eye behind.
Oh, because that's where your
like a
hand
mask.
goes. That's where your thumb goes.
Exactly. That's the artist eye that's looking through time.
So do you paint from live models?
Yes. I do.
Only?
I do. It's very hard for me to sit with you for this long and not start painting.
And you've done series of paintings.
Yes.
What kind of series do you say? Like movie stars? Would they be something
no,
like
I
this?
wouldn't call it movie stars, but I did it recently. I did a body of work that's called Larger Than Life.
And is that what these would be?
Absolutely, the portrait of Clint and Jack. They don't need
And Jack.
They don't need introduction for the last names. But the idea for Larger Than Life was to take personalities, celebrity faces, iconic faces that were meaningful to my life and my generation and many perhaps other generations. And the way that our mind, the way that our brain works, when you have something on the screen and you grew up with somebody, they become part of your everyday life. So when you look at your grandfather who's sitting next to you on the couch, and then you're watching Clint, shining together.
Oh, watching
those features sort of meld together because you have a memory of your grandfather and you have a memory of that person. And so even though this is really celebrities, these were self-portraits. These are my memories of growing up.
But I think all these portraits should, or they have, the artist's hand in there somewhere. Because they have to be a product of the artist. Not only you're painting me, but you're the artist painting it. It has your hand, it has your color, it has your style, and your nose maybe, or your eye.
And most important, I wanted it to be that you would see these iconic faces through my eyes, that you would see them as human beings, no longer, and that's why I said not celebrity, not movie stars, that you would see them as one of us.
And we have Tom Waits here too.
And Tom Waits, this was part of the series, making portraits on objects, that an object itself would add a layer of meaning. I had a Woody Allen on a frying pan, and they had, even Whole Foods bags. I had drawings on the Whole Foods bags, and that the actual object and its life would carry an extra meaning.
I see.
So Tom Waits on the suitcase.
So Tom Waits on the suitcase, walking through Texas, right?
Yeah,
or
New Orleans, probably.
New Orleans, probably, right. But those are not from life.
Yes.
And you love to paint from life.
Yes.
So how did you appropriate those kind of feelings other than pulling up your memory?
For that particular body of work, I actually, if it was a singer, for instance, for Bob Dylan's portrait, I listened to his songs. I listened to his voice. I read his lyrics. I really wanted to absorb him. I watched the interviews, and I tried to combine their actual art, into the work itself.
I see. So it really was depicting them from your memory of what you learned about them.
And for instance, in Jack Nicholson's portrait, one of his eyes almost looks like a snake eye. And the idea there is that he is so plastic in transforming himself from almost a human animal into any role. And I wanted to show this human animal nature of his face.
So him, though. Yeah. It is. It's so great.
And yet it's really, if you came close, it's a bunch of abstraction. It's really fluid and liquid and scratchy.
And how fast? Looks like you paint fast.
As one of the artists, I think it was Picasso, somebody said, it takes me my whole life, right? How long does it take? It takes me my whole life. But
5 minutes, right?
But I compare it to being pregnant, right? I mean, how fast do you make a baby? You're 9 months pregnant, but the actual birthing, though it's like painful, boom. But it's, So how long did you make the baby for, right?
I agree, because somebody said, oh, you just made a phone call for me. And I said, it took me 30 years to be able to pick up the phone and make that phone call, which was like you're saying.
So if I was to make your portrait, which I hope one day I will, because that's an incredible story in itself, your history of portraits that you've collected, but I would want to spend time with you. I would want to spend time thinking about you. I would want to even maybe write something about it. And after that gestation period, the actual painting can take 2 hours.
Oh, that's fast?
I mean, that's just the pushing out.
And we did. So these were from memory. These this series was
Yes.
from real life.
Yes, and I have 3 favorite models. It would not be fair if I didn't mention them. One is my grandmother,
Which is
Baba.
We have the pictures of
One
her.
is my daughter, Nika, who's now about to turn 9 years old, and one is Mark Snyder, who is phenomenal model.
Oh.
And there was a movie, actually, documentary made about our process together. Those 3 people that I painted for years now, they allow me to use my imagination and reach out to humanity. I could make anybody's portrait because of their iconic faces. For me, they're iconic.
But they're familiar with you too.
Yes.
And is it easier to paint something that's familiar?
Worse. And I would say not familiar. I would say the more love, with the more emotion
Like
you
these?
have.
Yeah.
If you have a real love, you don't see. Painting is about seeing. If you have love, you don't have edges. I can't see where my mom's edges are. I can't paint my mom, right? It's just one blur of light.
All the time.
Right?
You haven't painted her?
Just terrible. It's just terrible. I can't find her contour. So it's the biggest challenge to paint those who you relate to. Probably people you hate, probably the easiest.
Well, then what about, that's what I was going to say. When you start to paint a series, how do you choose it? How do you decide?
I don't. For me, it's a very meditative process, and it's after you make a few paintings, and you kind of going in the dark, you stand back and you say, oh, there's something similar about it, and then you start seeing where you're going, and later on you add title to it and organize it. But it's very much
so
like
you're just painting and painting?
It's very much by intuition.
What about the process? Do you actually prime your own canvas, or are they on canvas? What is it?
I order canvases for now almost 25 years from the same man, and I have to say his name is Art.
Art.
So you can't go Art Canvases, the best canvases in town. I highly recommend them. And so I've been faithful to him ever since I came to this country.
So does he prime them?
I prime them.
You
so
prime
I order the stretched canvases, and I believe the first mark of that ground that you put, that puts your energy into the painting. So when you prime, which is very physical process, and you inhale all these fumes and you have to sweat, but you meditate and you create a kind of a space on the person who is going to inhabit this portrait. So for me, the priming is almost like a meditation.
So that's part of the process.
And I always begin with background first. So you have to create a space. So there's always a wash of color.
But is it for one particular person that you're creating this, or you're creating the canvas first and then you're bringing someone into it?
I create a space for the person, and then the person comes into it.
Then the person, but do you know who that person is while you're creating the space?
It depends. It depends. Yeah.
And how do you choose your subjects? Are they commissioned, or are they?
I have both. My favorite commissions, of course, are not the ones that when somebody says, and I have my favorite dog, and then and make my diamond bigger and my birthmark smaller.
Make my neck longer. That's what Andy Warhol used to make, like long necks. He said ladies like to have long swan necks.
Yeah, no, I love wrinkles and hair, and I love expression. So I actually age people by maybe 10, 15 years. There's a great artist, Jimmy Hayward. You know Jimmy?
I know Jim Hayward
Jimmy,
very well.
I made his portrait, and Jimmy has just such a funny way I love Jimmy.
But he's an abstract painter.
Yes,
too.
but he's a painter's painter.
Yeah.
And he looked at my portrait and said, I always used to wonder, you're so weird. I mean, portraits are supposed to flatter people, and you age people by 10 years. But now that I'm 10 years older, you're actually flattering me in retrospect.
Because he looks better than he...
Yeah, because the painting stays the same.
It's very funny because I interviewed Jim Hayward in Beverly Hills at Beverly Hills High, when we used to tape in that studio. And he said, I'm going to do your portrait. And so you're an abstract painter.
Pink painting.
And he just painted. It was very, very flat.
Yeah.
Just flat, like he'd drawn a circle and a head. And I mean, but it was the set at Beverly High that he had painted.
And Jimmy was one of the art center advisors. That's
was
where I
he?
met him.
Yeah, he's pretty brilliant.
Yeah.
So your work is commissioned, or
it's
depends
both
on what you want?
I've had some really great privileges of making a commission portrait for Zach Brown and for Joe Manganiello. some really great, people that I've met, some artists. But
are they huge?
They're
or they're
huge.
different sizes?
They're huge.
Okay.
Make space in your place, in your homes right now. and others, most of my paintings are done for myself. And if they found a collector, that's great. But I paint because I can't help not to.
So just paint the subject matter. The work that you've done has been shown in museums and galleries, and most recently in Santiago, Chile.
Yes. And this was an amazing story because I had my work shown at LA Art Show. It was noticed by the editor of Arte Al Limite, which is the biggest magazine in South America. And they did a profile, an amazing story, which is called, I think, something like a palette, an artist's palette. And this story about my aunt was featured there. And they did a whole beautiful poetic, only how they could do it writers in South America and create this beautiful story. And then I found out that they're actually building a museum in Chile, and they approached me to acquire work for permanent collection.
It's such a great country. Santiago is so beautiful.
And they acquired the portrait of Sting.
Oh, is that the one?
Part of my larger than
So it's
life.
like from this series of Larger Than Life?
And what I love about that portrait is not just his face, but you have just a little bit of his fingers, and it almost looks like sign language, like he's trying to communicate to you. And if you can just crack the code, you'll know what he's saying.
We talked about your being an educator and talking about museums. Yes. There's the picture of Sting right now. It looks so great that you were talking about. But we also talked, and everything that you say about your work seems to be like for education. Yes. And you did do education up at the Getty.
Yes, I did.
So tell us a little bit
that.
about that.
So I taught for 12 years at the Getty at the education department.
Which is so great, that education department. They do so much research there, don't they?
It's incredible. You work with curators, you work with research institutes, you work with designers, the exhibition. It's very incredible.
And it's open to people to go and learn there.
And what I specialized in creating aesthetic experiences, inspirational experience for people in the galleries. And also we had studio where we made art and we related it to what was on display. And so you could learn the technique and get closer to the art to understand, even if you've never done art before, if you wanted to learn how to sculpt in clay or how to draw in charcoal and then relate, for instance, that you touch the paper a certain way. You look at Seurat's charcoal versus Leonardo's Da Vinci drawing, different because you've tried it. So I led these kind of wonderful programs.
The class was to learn to look at things in a different way,
to connect to it in a physical way, which was perfect for me. So that's where the art and the educator and the art historian and me really came together. And now I offer these experiences through my nonprofit.
And that also, I was going to say, we'll talk about your nonprofit now, because I think when artists give back, that's the most important thing. They're giving of themselves by painting and sculpting, but they also give back to the community in so many different ways. And we started this interview with you're doing something for Beverly Hills and giving art for one of the charities there, and we're going to end it with what your nonprofit is now. Tell us about it.
So my nonprofit is called, or our nonprofit is called Project AWE. It's AWE. So
like and
because I believe there's no point in life if you don't have these kind of awe moments. And we wanted to give that aesthetic experience of awe to people through past, present, and future. So past in the way that you would relate to art and understand it through time, so almost rewriting art history in a way, and present in the art practice, supporting the art of contemporary artists who bring that sort of awe moment, and future by training young artists who are underprivileged, who are high school age and don't have a means or support to pursue their career. And we help them not only prepare the portfolio, but also to help them transition to college and build scholarships. And
because that's so important. We don't have art programs in the schools anymore, and we really need that. There's another place down by MacArthur Park, Art Division.
Yes.
And Dan McCleary does a lot of that with underprivileged
We had an
students.
overlap with him at the Getty.
Did you?
When he was an artist in residence at the Getty.
He's wonderful, and he's a fabulous portrait artist too.
Yes, he's
really
a
great.
lovely man.
Well, we could go on for hours, but they're telling me it's time to stop.
Before we stop, I must invite you to our Beverly Hills home, and you have to meet my parents.
Oh,
so
that
you
would
must
my
be our
pleasure.
guest.
Beverly Hills all the
Exactly.
way. Thank you very much, Zhenya Gershman, and thank you for watching the Beverly Hills View today.